Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder Historian, and we've came to the end of my animated battle map series for the battles around Chattanooga. However, there is one more battle within this set, which will be the Battle of Ringgold Gap. Ulysses S. Grant became incredibly frustrated at William T. Sherman's failure to capture the north end of Missionary Ridge at Tunnel Hill. Now, Grant knew that to relieve the pressure in front of Sherman, he needed to make an advance against the Confederate center on Missionary Ridge. The Southerners' position looked intimidating at first glance, but in reality it was poorly equipped to sustain such a massive assault that Grant had planned. Braxton Bragg and John C. Breckinridge believed that a head-on assault by Union forces at their crest was not likely, and instead strengthened their flanks, believing the only serious attacks would come from there. Thus, the fortifications in the Confederate center were sporadic and ill-equipped. Not until the night of the 23rd of November did Breckinridge direct that work begin on strengthening the rifle pits and breastworks for an impending attack. He also directed Patton Anderson to remove half of his division from their positions at the foot of the ridge to the crest, further weakening the lower fortifications. The rebels on the crest faced the disadvantage of being placed too close to the top of the ridge, which meant that they would be silhouetted against the sky to the attacking blue troops. Furthermore, rebel artillery on top would have trouble firing on approaching Federals because they could not depress their barrels enough to shoot accurately at the forces in the valley below. For the 2 days leading up to the battle on the 25th, troops changed positions, ultimately weakening the foot of the ridge, and the Army of Tennessee simply did not have the capability to devise such intricate fortifications that were needed. General Manigault complained that details were made to construct breastworks. Some 40 entrenching tools were furnished for this purpose, but were taken away by superior authority, after having had the use of them for 2 or 3 hours. There were but 4 axes in the command. The consequence was that the work progressed slowly, and the protection obtained against the enemy's fire in this new line was poor and insufficient. In the valley between Chattanooga and Missionary Ridge, the Confederates had created a beautiful field of fire. They denuded the valley to have a clear view of the enemy as they approached, for keeping them warm and for building fortifications. It was now after 3 p.m. Grant and George Thomas again discussed a movement against the ridge with Thomas's Army of the Cumberland, but Thomas wasn't willing to agree to such a movement with his small force against such an impregnable-looking position. Grant walked away. After his aide John Rawlins shamed him into ordering Thomas to move, Grant then gave the official order to Thomas to take the entrenchments at the base of the ridge to relieve the pressure on Sherman. Thomas and Gordon Granger, one of Thomas's corps commanders, discussed the matter further, then parted ways. Minutes passed and no Union soldiers were moving. Grant inquired as to why they weren't advancing. Thomas said that Granger was directed to move the men forward, but Granger was helping to aim and fire an artillery piece close by. Grant snapped at Granger, saying, "If you will leave the battery to its captain and take command of your corps, it'll be better for all of us." With that scolding, Granger set his attack in motion. Union soldiers started coming out of their entrenchments, collecting their stacked arms and adjusting their equipment. As the battle lines formed, the blue troops knew that the leaf-bare woods would provide them with a little shelter from the lead and iron raining down on them, but upon exiting the woods, each brigade either had 300 to 700 yards to march through the denuded valley before reaching the rebel lines, dependent on their placement. It took roughly an hour for the thousands of troops to form up. Each regimental commander received the orders for attacking the ridge. Commander of Company B of the 124th Ohio remembered, "No emotion was visible in the soldierly face of our brave colonel, save perhaps a little more violent chewing of a large quid of the weed that added rotundity to his bronzed, weather-beaten cheek." His further order was that we inform each man in the ranks of what was expected of him. Commanding at the time Company B, it was my painful duty to break the news to those that I had known from boyhood, that I had learned to love as brothers. No one that I communicated the order to but turned pale. Now there was nothing to do but wait. Now the time hung heavy. Now the soldier's thoughts were filled with home and loved ones left behind, and what would become of them if he should fall in the terrific charge that he knew would soon have to be made. It is the dreadful waiting that is more terrible than the shock of battle. Grant had ordered Thomas's men at the sound of 6 guns fired in rapid succession from Fort Wood to assault and take the rifle pits and halt. However, his orders were horribly misunderstood by many commanders, wondering what to do after they halted in the rifle pits. General Absalom Baird, upon hearing the order, asked, "And when we have captured the rifle pits, what then?" The answer came, I have given you the order in the exact words of General Grant." Not having received clarification, Baird sent his orders to his brigade commanders, who passed it down to regimental and company commanders. Confusion was running rampant in the Union battle line. General August Willock, a former soldier in the Prussian army, claimed the only order he received was to advance. A major under Willock reportedly asked him where they were to stop, and Willock replied, "I don't know. At hell, I expect." General Philip Sheridan was also confused by the order. He wrote, "While riding from right to left and closely examining the first line of pits occupied by the enemy, which seemed as though they would prove untenable after being carried, the doubt arose in my mind as to whether I had properly understood the original order, and I dispatched Captain Ransom of my staff to ascertain from General Granger whether it was the first line that was to be carried or the ridge. He had scarcely left me when the signal was given, and the division marched to the front." It was about 4 p.m. and Thomas's troops were ready. The ground ahead of them looked ominous as Missionary Ridge leered over them, and the Confederates could be seen bristling the top. When those 6 guns belched forth their signal for Thomas's men to advance, 23,000 Union troops stepped off, aimed at Missionary Ridge. Worry set in on all Southern soldiers from the rank and file to commanders that Missionary Ridge could not be held against such an immense attack. The valley seemed to be an ocean with the Federal battle lines appearing as waves. A few rebels in the ranks lost their nerve and slipped out of their trenches. One soldier who deserted claimed he was willing to fight the Yankees 2 to our 1, but when he heard old Grant command "Attention world, by nation's right and left wheel," he thought it was about time for him to retire. A massive cannonade erupted from Missionary Ridge as Confederate artillery sent iron at the blue lines, but the hail of iron did little damage to the approaching Federals. Many of the rounds exploded too high in the air for them to have any effect on the enemy. The cannoneers simply couldn't depress the barrels low enough. Grant had ordered the men not to fire during the advance, making the Northerners quicken their pace. Just prior to the Union stepping off, Bragg, scared of a gap between Tyler and Tucker's brigades, ordered Reynolds' brigade to the top of the ridge. This movement was made as the Union approached. However, Reynolds' brigade's position at the base did not match the position at the crest, and his men moved through Tyler's brigade, causing confusion through the ranks. When Reynolds did settle into his correct spot, he only had a portion of his brigade. The others were still trying to extricate themselves from the entangled battle lines to his left. This left a huge gap at the base of the ridge. Confederates in the lower rifle pits were unable to make sense of what was happening. Breckinridge had ordered them to fire one volley and then proceed up the ridge to the crest. However, that order failed to reach most regiments and companies. Therefore, the ones who had not received the order and stood and fought, it looked like their comrades around them were retreating. The Floridians on the rebel left are a great example of those who didn't receive the order and stood their ground until the skirmishing fire became too great and they laid down in the rifle pits. Some, like Robert Watson of the 7th Florida, skedaddled up the slope to the crest safety. He remembered the hill was dreadful steep, and the enemy kept up a continual fire and threw a continual shower of bullets among us, and I only wonder that they did not kill all of us. Many a poor fellow fell exhausted and was taken prisoner. I stopped several times and took a shot at the Yankees, and at the same time it rested me. The bullets flew around us so thick that it seemed impossible to escape unhurt. A bullet struck my knapsack at the right shoulder and came out at the left shoulder, making 23 holes in my blanket. When I reached the top of the ridge, I was so much exhausted that I fell down and lay there for several minutes to recover breath. Due to the terrain, the various Union brigades reached the rifle pits at different times, still cohesive in many respects. When they reached the rifle pits, they encountered empty fortifications or light resistance, because the majority of Southerners began to retreat. Some artillery pieces were able to get a range on the blue troops and threw rounds into the new occupants of the rifle pits. Union commanders, one by one, upon reaching the base, ordered their men forward to the crest because it was too dangerous to stay put. It was an arduous journey up the steep slope. Grant, at Orchard Knob, saw his lines moving past the rifle pits and began interrogating both Thomas and Gordon Granger as to who ordered them up the ridge. Both men denied having given the order, and Grant fumed. What happened next was a result of slow communication and overall miscommunication. Sheridan, who had dispatched Captain Ransom to ask Granger whether it was the first line or the crest he was supposed to take, got an answer. Ransom came back saying it was the first. Sheridan interpreted that as his men needed to fall back. However, his men were already engaging with Confederate skirmishers just below the crest. Confused, he ordered his men to fall back. The blue troops took heavy casualties doing so, but they eventually made it to the rifle pits. However, there still remained many Federal troops on the ridge who refused to give up the position they had worked so hard to acquire. Sheridan saw his demoralized men retreating and decided to act. He then realized that the rest of the Army of the Cumberland was put in danger upon him retreating. He rode down the line offering encouragement to his men. He promised, "It's all right, boys. When you catch your breath, you can go on again." His men cheered as they got word that they were about to rejoin the assault. Sheridan's men lurched forward again. At this time, Baird's division had just reached the base because of the mangled terrain in their front. Wood's division was halfway up the slope. The Union assault was a mangled mess. One survivor of the assault described it as such. In making the ascent of the ridge, the men naturally sought shelter of the ravines and avoided the backbone of the projecting ridges in order to shelter themselves as far as possible from the enemy's crossfire. Another wrote, "Each battalion assumed a triangle shape, the colors at the apex surrounded by the strongest men, the flanks trailing to the rear." Wood's division in the center of the Union line reached the Confederates on the crest first. The three brigades, entangled in the defiles of the ridge, formed up about 50 yards in front of the Mississippians with a slight rise protecting them. They fixed bayonets and charged into the rebels. Many Southerners simply surrendered where they stood. An officer from Ohio had a man from Mississippi ask, "Captain, I want to surrender. What shall I do?" The officer stated, "Get over them logs to this side. You'll be in the United States then." Some of Tucker's Mississippians began running to the rear. A squad from the 6th Ohio captured a pair of 12-pound Napoleons. The weapons were loaded, but they couldn't find friction primers. One quick thinker yelled, "Stand back," and placed his rifle over the vent of one of the cannons and pulled the trigger. The blast from the rifle ignited the artillery round and sprayed the retreating rebels. To the south, members of the 1st Ohio, 41st Ohio, and 23rd Kentucky planned a charge similar to their comrades. Lieutenant Colonel Langdon ordered the three regiments to fix bayonets, and as he stood up to order the charge, a bullet smashed into his face. He fell to the ground and the men stayed still, not making a sound. Then Langdon rose to his feet, with blood streaming down his face onto his uniform, and said, "I am not killed yet." He ordered the charge, and the Ohioans and Kentuckians captured the works held by Reynolds' brigade. When they topped the ridge, an Ohioan named Levi Wagner was on a mission. He had lost a knapsack at Chickamauga and was determined to replace it with a Confederate one. He continued on over the ridge, captured a rebel, and then found a little plane full of knapsacks that the Southerners had relieved themselves of in the panic. As he said, "After looking over a few, I chose one which I thought would supply all my needs. Upon examining my prize, I found a good government blanket, 2 shirts, 2 pairs of drawers, a pair of light summer pants, a nightcap, a plug of tobacco, and a corn pone." General Bragg's line had been broken, and now he needed to stop the Union breakthrough. He pleaded with General Bate on his left to send troops, but Bate was having to fight off Sheridan's division that was fast approaching. Bate then thought of the 60th North Carolina, part of Reynolds' brigade, that had taken up a position behind his men. He ordered them to the north to confront the Yankees, but they would not go beyond where the artillery were emplaced. They were simply too scared. Amazingly, a well-placed Union artillery shell struck the limber behind the North Carolinians, killing horses and men alike. The 60th North Carolina took off in a panic. With a huge gap in the Confederate line and Federals surging through it, Bragg's defeat was imminent. Tyler's brigade of Tennesseans and Georgians held on for as long as they could, but the Federals were beginning to flank them. The Georgians on the far right of Tyler's line gave way as Wagner and Harker's brigades pushed into the Confederate lines. Bragg, mounted on his horse and carrying a flag, attempted to rally the retreating rebels, but the men retreating paid him no mind and continued their withdrawal. After a few moments of watching the battle line melt away, Bragg joined them. Thomas's men had had their rations limited prior to the battle, and many of them started the attack hungry. One soldier recounts what he did upon reaching the top of the ridge. "The first thing I did after the rebel skedaddled was to grab a full haversack and jerk it off a wounded rebel captain's neck. He was shot in the shoulder, and his hand lay on the mouth of the haversack on the downhill side. I opened it and divided its contents with my comrades in the immediate vicinity. It was saturated with the rebel captain's blood, but we ate it all the same." To the south, Hooker was pushing through Rossville Gap. Breckinridge had only a small group of Confederates, mostly Holtzclaw's Alabamians, to defend the ridge. Hooker's 3 divisions swarmed up over the ridge and approached the main Confederate line. On the Confederate right, the situation looked dire as rebel brigades dealt with enemy troops in their front and on their left flank. Manigault's brigade attempted to throw up some resistance to the flank attack, but the swelling numbers of Federals disintegrated the gray lines. One by one, regiments gave way to pressure. Dee's brigade, caught off guard and watching their left flank disappear, retreated down the eastern slope of the ridge. General Alfred Vaughn, keeping Phelps' brigade at bay in front of him, sent the 11th Tennessee and the consolidated unit of the 13th and 154th Tennessee to the left in an attempt to stop the Blue Surge. The Tennesseans put up a valiant effort, but they too were sent fleeing. It was now only a matter of Union regiments chasing after the retreating Confederates. Breckinridge and Bragg felt their way through the darkness along with the remnants of their ruined army as they trickled into Georgia. This wouldn't be the last of the Army of Tennessee, but it was a humiliating defeat, and now Chattanooga was firmly in Union hands. A misunderstanding where the attack was to stop resulted in the Army of the Cumberland regaining the honor that some people thought they'd lost at Chickamauga.